So I really appreciate that. I'm just going to, get my slideshow up. There. So what I've come to talk to you today is we're just going to have a conversation around the International Council on Harmonization, good clinical practices, and some practical tips. So just some of our learning objectives. We want to understand the purpose, the organization and structure of the ICH and their guidelines, to look at the investigator responsibilities when they're conducting clinical research, and review the requirements for complying with the informed consent regulations, review the process for obtaining informed consent, and if there's any alterations to the informed consent process, what do those look like? And also embedded throughout the presentation, I have some practical clinical research tips. And so, we'll just kind of talk about, it's okay to understand theoretically what these things are, but it's nice to see how they actually apply in the clinical research world. And Dan sent me some questions, which was great. You forwarded some really awesome questions. So I tried to incorporate those into the presentation as well. But I think at any time, if you have any questions, just let me know. I can't see hands raised or anything in the chat, so I'm sure Dan will keep an eye on that and just let me know if there's any questions along the way. And feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question, or I'm not sure if we want to leave them to the end. I'll just kind of, we'll kind of see how it goes throughout the presentation. So first, I just want to tell you what ICH E6GCP is. So really what it is, it's a standard that governs the design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analysis, and reporting of clinical trials. And it provides an assurance that if there's adherence to the ICH GCP principles, that the data that you collect and that are reported and the results are actually credible, accurate, and reproducible. And it also ensures that the rights, integrity, and well-being and confidentiality of research participants are protected. So essentially, GCP, which stands for Good Clinical Practice, E6. So E6 just refers to the kind of it's the efficacy module within the ICH guidelines, which there are over 200 of, but it's actually part of the efficacy section of their guidelines. And it's basically a standard that stipulates processes that should be followed in both study conduct and documentation. And what's the history behind it? So why they decided, many countries decided that they really needed some kind of a harmonization of guidelines, because different countries, European countries, US, they were conducting clinical trials, but they were really having challenges getting their regulatory authorities to accept the data, because there really wasn't a mechanism to do it all in the same way when they were being conducted in different countries. So they needed a process for determining the safety and efficacy of medicinal products before they were allowed on the market. So that was one thing, was that harmonization. The second thing, and probably the most important thing, was that there really needed to be a global standard in the way clinical trials were conducted, mostly born out of the tragedies that were the human rights atrocities that were conducted during World War II, which brought about the Nuremberg Code. There were, the thalidomide sort of tragedies of the 1960s. And actually, it was somebody within the FDA in the US that said, you know what, we have to be really careful and review the data and the information for these drugs before they're put on the market to understand how they work and their potential side effects. So because of those things, other countries began developing guidelines for this process, still kind of on their own, but there needed to be that harmonization. So that's how the birth of the International Conference on Harmonization became about in 1990s. They had an international conference. They came up with these guidelines, these good clinical practice guidelines, and everybody agreed that if our countries, if our regulatory authorities will agree that if researchers conducting research under these good clinical practice guidelines can submit their clinical trial data to regulatory authorities, then there won't be any need for duplication of clinical trial research. So the regulatory authorities said, yes, you know what, we buy in, we adopt GCP as a standard for clinical trial research. And clinical trials is basically defined as, there's a definition in GCP, but it's human research subject investigation, looking at what new drugs do to research participants, what's the safety, what's the efficacy, and really like a focused protocol to collect that information to see how these drugs work. So that's where GCP first came from. It came out in 1996, and it had its first revision 20 years later. So just a couple of years ago, and it was basically updated because, as we know, we're sort of migrating now into a more of a virtual paperless world. So the regulations sort of try to make revisions to try to reflect that. And why is it important? So as I mentioned, I think it does set that minimum standard for quality for the design and conduct of clinical trials in human subjects, and as well as for the recording and reporting of clinical trial data. So E6 is really around how studies are conducted, and there's another efficacy guideline, which is E8, is really how clinical trials should be designed. There's a number of them that we look at when we work in clinical trials. So E6 is primarily the good clinical practice, what you need to do in order to do a clinical research properly to ensure that your data is credible and that your patients are protected when they're research subjects or research participants. And E8 is, how do you design a good quality clinical trial according to a certain set of standards. But today we're focusing on E6. So this is really about conduct. How do you safely and ethically conduct a clinical research study? So if there's adherence with all the principles in good clinical practice, what that does is ensures that the right safety and well-being of study participants are protected, and the integrity of the data submitted to the regulatory authorities for approval is credible. So that data has integrity, it's got credibility, and there's that reproducibility is there as well. So it sets a standard for that mutual accountability among sponsors, regulatory authorities, REBs as Research Ethics Board, and investigators, which are the physicians that are conducting the research. And it also provides guidance on the content of protocols, what amendments are, IB is investigators' brochure, and it also defines what essential clinical trial documents are. So all in all, it's made a point down there. There's actually 20 individual guidelines within good clinical practice, GCP. There's an underpinning of ethical principles within GCP. There's a new revision now coming out. It's up for public consultation. It'll be R3. What we're working under now is GCP E6 R2. So it's actually been whittled down hugely from 13 to 11, which is not a big revision, but still. But essentially, what the principles talk about is that clinical trials should be conducted in accordance with ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki. So the Declaration of Helsinki is an ethical code of conduct for physicians that are conducting clinical trials. Before initiating a trial, that the foreseeable risks and inconveniences should be weighed against the anticipated benefit for the individual trial subject and society. The right, safety, and well-being of trial subjects are the most important considerations and should prevail over interests of science and society. And you can see how historically how the history feeds into these principles. So if you think about it, I mean, World War II, right? So we had prisoners of war who were subjected to investigation purely for the interest of science. These were just such huge atrocities. There was no informed consent. They were prisoners of war. They were subjected to these terrible experimentation purely for the interest of the Germans and looking for science. In particular, how long could their army be subjected or be out in the cold without having frostbite? That's what they were interested in. So all of these kinds of things, all of these historical things that happened, you'll see they're embedded in these principles of GCP. That the available non-clinical and clinical information on investigational products should be adequate to support the proposed clinical trial. So any kind of testing that was done, bench testing, animal testing, all that information has to feed into the investigational product to make sure there's enough information on how it works and what are the risks known up until that point. So clinical trials should be scientifically sound and described in a clear, detailed protocol. And I just made a note down there about the World Medical Association and the ethical principles for physicians conducting research. A trial should be conducted in compliance with a protocol that has received prior IRB, IEC, approval. Those are all your Research Ethics Board oversight committees. They're called different things. They're IRBs in the US, they're IECs or RECs in the UK, and REBs are Research Ethics Boards in Canada. That the medical care given to medical decisions made on behalf of subjects should always be the responsibility of a qualified physician or, when appropriate, a qualified dentist. So Health Canada has the same regulations. Health Canada has actually adopted the GCP principles, the good clinical practice principles, and they're actually law. So within Health Canada regulations, if you submit a clinical trial application, you're legally bound to comply with GCP. It's actually it's federal law now. And Health Canada, similarly to ICH, defines a qualified investigator or a principal investigator as a physician who has medical certification to practice in that province. So, our clinical investigators under a CTA or clinical trial application have to be physicians that are medically licensed to practice medicine in New Brunswick. And it's the same with dentists. There's some talk about trying to expand the scope within the regulations to allow nurse practitioners and maybe even pharmacists to be qualified investigators, but that actually, it hasn't happened yet. Each individual involved in conducting trials should be qualified by education, qualifications, and experience to perform his or her respective tasks. This is a really important one because if you're involved in clinical research, training is one huge element that regulatory authorities like Health Canada will look at. When they come to a site, they want to see that your principal investigator, if they're doing a clinical trial in oncology, is an oncologist and has experience, qualified by education, so medical education in oncology and training in research. So they're going to look at their CVs and to determine whether or not they have those important qualifications. And that's also in our responsibility of the Research Ethics Board as well, to ensure that qualified investigators have the appropriate training in order to undertake that trial. Every subject should freely give informed consent before clinical trial participation. And again, right, so these are rooted back in that Nuremberg Code. And the first principle in the Nuremberg Code that was released in 1947 says that every individual that participates in a research study has to give their informed consent to participate in that trial. And Declaration of Helsinki came out in 1964, which, like I've mentioned a couple of times, is the ethical principles of conduct of research for physicians engaged in clinical trials, allows for substitute decision maker. So, because they recognize that a huge population was potentially excluded from participation in research if they did not have the capacity to provide informed consent. So Declaration of Helsinki puts some language around how you can enroll patients like either children or that vulnerable population without capacity safely in a clinical research study. Clinical trial information should be recorded, handled, and stored in a way that allows its accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. And this principle applies to all records. So whether they're paper or electronic, if you make a note on a sticky note that's relevant to a patient visit or something, that's considered a record. That's a clinical trial record. So I guess the two things to remember when we're talking about GCP and the principles The two main things are everything that we do when we follow this principle is one, to ensure the safety of the participant, and two, the integrity of the data. That's what it is. So everything that you do is trying to make sure that you're doing those two things. You're protecting your research participants, and you're collecting information that has integrity and credibility and reproducibility. The confidentiality of records that could identify subjects should be protected. So, that's the process of informed consent. That's a process of de-identifying information when you collect it. All the data management that you put around data collection to ensure that there's data is secure and you're protecting the confidentiality and the privacy of your research participants. Investigational products should be manufactured in accordance with GMP. This is actually a regulatory requirement. So this would be something that a sponsor, especially in the clinical trial world, are typically big pharmaceutical companies. So we'll take one, for example, Moderna with COVID-19 vaccines. So when they created their vaccines, in order to get them out on the market, or if they're going to use them in a clinical trial, they have to demonstrate to regulatory authority that they were manufactured, handled, and stored in accordance with good manufacturing practices. And the last one is systems and procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of the trial should be in place. What this means essentially is you have standard operating procedures in place. So if we look at every participant should give informed consent before they're put on a study. Do you have a standard operating procedure in place that says, how are you going to do that, right? So what is your mechanism for getting informed consent from research participants? So systems and procedures, standard operating procedures, just reduces that variability and how different members of your team will approach how they do the informed consent process. So some of the investigators' responsibilities, I had to kind of chuckle when I saw that. It's Stella's slide, but anyway, I liked it. So we're just going to talk about some of those. There are many, and when an investigator, a physician, qualified investigator, there's many terms, but they all mean the same, principal investigator. This is your physician who's in charge of your clinical trial. So the investigator is signatory to a clinical trial agreement. If you're doing a study with a sponsor, a pharmaceutical company, within Health Canada, the sponsor has the ultimate responsibility for the conduct of the trial. When sponsors go to a site and contract out or bring on a principal investigator and a site, they delegate responsibilities to that investigator. The way they delegate those responsibilities legally is through a clinical trial agreement. So that's why your principal investigators are usually named in your clinical trial agreement. It's a legal document that's legally binding the two parties, and you'll see GCP principles within that, the legal language of a clinical trial agreement. The principal investigator is the king or queen or what, and they're the royal responsibility. They wear the crown. Everything is their responsibility. So it's tiered delegation, right? So they're sponsored, tiered down to principal investigator, tiered down to the team. So the investigator can't possibly undertake all of the responsibilities associated with running a clinical trial. So they delegate those responsibilities to their clinical research team, but they maintain that overall responsibility for what their delegated folks are doing. They have to ensure that all of their teams are trained on good clinical practices, on their standard operating procedures, on their protocol, and then subsequently, if there's any amendments to the protocols or changes to the design of the study or changes to a process in the study, that relevant people have training on those changes, that they bring on staff with proper training, education, and experience. Health Canada will look at qualifications of clinical research nurses. We've had multiple Health Canada inspections at Horizon, and one of the questions was they had a nurse clinician who was doing physical assessments, And so we actually had to go to NA and B, the Nurses Association of New Brunswick, and get a statement to say that nurses are qualified to do that, that it's within their scope of practice. So you have to stay within your scope of practice. You have to get research training on good clinical practices, and you have to maintain a training file for each one of your members within your team. The PI delegates duties to others, and that's captured on a delegation log. Principal investigator confirms eligibility of subjects or participants. So within a clinical trial, they'll say we need patients who are, over 65 that have a diagnosis of non-small cell lung cancer. Well, that's a medical diagnosis, eligibility. So the only ones that can confirm that somebody has that stage, whatever, lung cancer, is a physician. They must assign causality to adverse events and serious adverse events. Again, is this adverse event related to their participation in the study? Is it related to the investigational product? Only a physician can make that determination. They ensure that reporting requirements are fulfilled to both the Research Ethics Board, the sponsor, and that SAEs, AEs, deviations, protocol violations, and amendments are reported properly. They have the responsibility for the medical care of the participant, and they also are accountable for any failures at the site. So if anything happens, if anything goes wrong, if anything wasn't reported, they ultimately have that responsibility for the trial conduct at the site. And they must have co-Is, a co-investigator, so another physician, should there be an absence, if they wanted to go away or something, somebody medically has to have oversight of participants in the study. So I talked about serious adverse events a little bit. And so serious adverse event is defined as any untoward medical occurrence that results in death, hospitalization, prolongs hospitalization, or it's, causes incapacity. So serious adverse events, once you are aware of it, if you're the research coordinator or if you're a member of the team, once you become aware of it, you have 24 hours to send the report to your sponsor and to the Research Ethics Board, if applicable. The Research Ethics Board has its own guidelines for what they want reported to them. So, you can find out whether or not this is something that would be reportable to them. Coordinator is research coordinator. That can be a research coordinator nurse, or it can be another member of the team, collects the information. But again, the investigator, the co-investigator must assign causality and determine the severity. If there's any chance that unblinding might be required for medical treatment of the participant, that has to go to the sponsor first. That's a really big deal. If you have to unblind it, it's a huge process. I don't think, in the probably close to 30 years that I've been working in this field, that I've ever seen an unblinding, and I started out as a research nurse, so it doesn't typically happen. Protocol deviations. Protocol deviations are considered a change from the protocol. So when your Research Ethics Board approves your protocol and it's version date June 2023, if there's something that's your study plan, right? That's your blueprint, how you're gonna conduct your study. So if there's a change from what's in that plan that wasn't approved by the REB, and it's not, it's kind of an administrative type thing, for example, because we live in New Brunswick and we're snowed in from, December till June, if a patient can't make it back to the site for a visit, and they're out of window at a visit window, then that would be considered a protocol deviation. Or if they didn't completely, fill out a questionnaire. So they typically don't have a potential impact on patient safety. They're just more or less administrative sort of variations or strays from the protocol. A research violation, on the other hand, is a little different. So a violation is something that veered away from the protocol that does have the potential impact on subjects' safety or their rights or well-being. So For example, the participant receives the wrong investigational treatment dose. That's considered a serious protocol violation. Or their patient was randomized, but they actually didn't meet the eligibility requirements. So those reporting requirements are to the sponsor as soon as you're aware, and to the REB. And we also say, if a patient got an incorrect dose, patient needs to be aware. You need to tell them as well that there was an error. Deviations, on the other hand, the REB doesn't typically want to see them. Our REB, though, I think wants to see everything, but I think you could, like minor deviations, you can kind of lump them up and send them in a couple at a time. Violations are more required to be reported as they happen to sponsor and to research ethics board. A waiver is something we don't always see. So deviations, violations are not planned, right? They're things that just kind of happen. Waivers, you can get a waiver from the sponsor if you know that your participant is not going to be around, they're going to miss a study visit. You can let them know and they'll issue a waiver. And that just says that for this particular study patient, we're waiving the requirements for visit 7 to be done 7 to 10 days because the patient is not going to be, they're not going to be available. Amendments, there any written description or change to a protocol. Amendments need to be approved by the Research Ethics Board before they're implemented at a site. One exception to that is if there is a need to immediately make a change to remove a hazard, or in the interest of safety of research participants, then it can be implemented right away. However, you do need to let the REB know and let the sponsor know as well. And amendments typically come to you from the sponsor of the study. And you'll usually see it once the study's been up and running for a while and they're seeing that, we're not getting our number of patients hitting this visit, so why don't we drop a visit or things like that. Health Canada has outlined what needs to be submitted to them more formally and what they only need to be notified of. So that's a clinical trial application A or amendment, or a clinical trial notification, or essentially an administrative notification to Health Canada. Investigators' responsibilities in GCP. So some of the non-compliance issues that came up in Health Canada inspections include lack of investigator oversight. They can tell if there are physical assessment exams that the principal investigator was supposed to do and they didn't sign on the bottom of the page. They don't have their initials next to lab values. Looking at those types of things and signing and dating them is really a good indication that the principal investigator is watching what's happening to their study patients. Insufficient study staff training, that's in missing documentation or missing certifications and training files. Protocol deviations. So protocol deviations, if there are many of them, there's something happening at the site, right? There's something going on there, depending on what type of deviations they are, that maybe there needs to be more training of your research staff, but a number of deviations is not necessarily a good thing. It can mean that there might need to be some additional education and training. No systems or processes in place. So if you have missing standard operating procedures, they look at that. Discrepancies between source document, meaning hospital records, and the information that's collected for the sponsor, which is called a case report form. And failure to reconsent participants after protocol amendments. If the REB has asked you to reconsent them and you haven't, that's a deficiency. And I know this is really, it's really clinical trial, regulated clinical trial focused, but good clinical practice guidelines can be adopted for any study. Like there are principles and practices from GCP that can be applicable to just about any research study. It's just that it's really highly regulated in the clinical trial in the sort of drug world, because like I mentioned, it's for that regulatory approval process. But there's a number of principles here that are really applicable to just about every clinical research study. Informed consent is a big one. So GCP says it's a process by which participants voluntarily confirm his or her willingness to participate in a trial. So they have to be informed of all aspects of the study that are relevant to their decision to participate. And informed consent is documented by a means of written, signed, and dated informed consent. And there are some alterations to that, which we will talk about. And the NIH, or the National Institute of Health in the U.S., has now mandated that there be a kind of like a cocktail summary on the front page of consent forms to say it's really brief. Here's what the study is. Here are the risks. I guess the challenge is that relevant risks would be different for everybody. So it's just trying to determine what would be the information that the most reasonable person would want to know in order to make an informed decision. And one of the examples the NIH gave was, a real potential of male participants in this research study receiving this drug would be sterility. So that could be a real material relevant risk that somebody would want to know. So they want what do you have to do when you're in the study? Here's what we're asking you to do. Here's your time commitment, and here are the risks. Because I don't know if anybody on this call has seen a clinical trial informed consent document, but they can run up to 30 pages long. So a patient who is sick and being presented with this document, it can be pretty daunting and pretty overwhelming. And the purpose, it goes back to the principle of autonomy, right? So there's 3 ethical principles. There's respect for persons or autonomy. There's beneficence and non-maleficence. So you balance risks and burdens of research. And then there's justice. And justice means that everybody should have an equal opportunity to participate in a research study, that we shouldn't overuse one particular population. And also that participants in research should have the opportunity to be recipients of the benefits of the study, should there be any. So those are the 3 core ethical principles, and informed consent speaks directly to respect for persons. So it's really to protect them, whether they're patients or healthy volunteers. It has to be voluntary. It's completely up to them whether they want to participate in a research study, and there's no repercussions if they say, hey, no, it's not for me. You have to make sure that they clearly understand the benefits and risks, and provide them with all the information needed in order to make a decision on whether or not to take part. So, that goes back to the NIH saying, what are these relevant material risks that I need to know for me in order to make an informed decision? It is a process, so it's not just a form, and it starts, with having that conversation about what trial participation means. What does it mean for you? And that they kind of fully grasp what it is that we're asking them to do. And there are ways that you can kind of determine that. You can sort of ask some probing questions like, so we just had this conversation about informed consent. Can you tell me a little bit, like in your perspective, what do you think we're asking you to do? Like those are pretty easy ways to say, to try to find out if they fully understand what the research project is about. And then there's the actual consent, right? So consent is a legal term. So consent to voluntarily accept, and they provide the permission to be in the study. So that's the actual, physical signature on a page. And it has to be ongoing. So it doesn't end when they sign the consent form. Every time they come back in for a visit, you really need to say, you're in the study, you're still willing to participate. Just want to make sure that everything seems to be going well from your perspective. It doesn't take long to ask them those questions. And continuous, depending on the length of the study. And then if there are changes to the study that might be relevant to them. So what if there's new risks that has been determined when they did an interim analysis or something, or they started seeing all these SAEs and now they've updated the consent form? You need to go back to them and say, you know what, like as a result of all this data that's now coming in, this is a new risk. And I want to inform you about it. And I want to, is this something that's going to change your mind or affect your willingness to participate in the study. They need to be informed about that. Planning the consent process. So you have to, within your team, you have to determine how you're involved, who's going to be involved in the participant-informed consent process. There's a couple of schools of thought. Some people will say that the principal investigator, who is also, a treating physician, has competing interests and probably shouldn't be the one approaching their patients to participate in a research study. So that's where, you mitigate that by having a member of your research team, like your research coordinator, go in and have a conversation and talk about informed consent, and actually get informed consent. And then you can bring your principal investigator in if there's any clinical questions that, that they want to have answered. The circle of care is a big thing from a privacy perspective, so I wear that hat as well. So if you wouldn't normally have access to a list of patients in order to look at their chart to determine whether or not they're eligible, if you wouldn't normally have access to that information within the scope of your job, you don't have access to it as a research assistant. So there's ways around that. If there's somebody within the circle of care, an administrative assistant, or a nurse that's working in a clinic, the nurse can approach the participant and say, looks like you may be eligible to participate in a study. Can the research assistant or research nurse contact you to talk to you about the study, yes or no? So there are ways to get around that, to ensure that, I'm also looking that the things that, or process things that we do, that they're compliant with privacy legislation as well. And your informed consent process, again, it's should be well documented in a standard operating procedure. So some of the things when you're planning that is to consider your potential patient population. So what's their age, their health status, language. So do you anticipate that there could be somebody in your study who might need translation of the document? Now, our Research Ethics Board doesn't require that all the documents, the informed consent documents, be translated into French. But I think if patients should have the right to receive the information in the language that they're most comfortable with. So if you want to put a patient on a study that's speaking another language, remember that informed consent is not just that document. Somebody, if they're a translator or family member or something, would have to be available at every step along the way to make sure that any new information is understood and patient expectations are understood and those types of things. So it's really kind of it would be an unfair exclusion to not include somebody because of language. We would try to make accommodations to bring somebody into a study with translation and things like that. Capacity, that's a whole other thing. So capacity, our Research Ethics Board says that participants have to be 19 years or older, because 19 is the age of majority in New Brunswick. And what about so anybody under the age of 19, that would be assent, and then there'd be parental or guardian consent in addition to that. Impaired capacity, if somebody had cognitive impairment and could not provide consent on their own behalf, and the study can only include patients from that population because that's a population under study, then there's a mechanism for substitute decision maker. But all of these things have to be planned out in advance of the Research Ethics Board application, because the REB is going to ask you if there's any alteration to the informed consent process, and you have to describe what that looks like. The dialogue and time consideration. Do you have lots of time to get information to these patients? Can they take the consent form home and have a few days to read about it, talk about it with their family? Those types of things. Or is it an emergency department study where they're having a heart attack right there, and you need to get informed consent from the SDM and then subsequently to the patient? So, what kind of study is it, and how much time are you going to have? Cultural considerations. I'm thinking specifically about research within Indigenous peoples. There are, a whole different process around how they need to be engaged in the informed consent process. So it's really understanding the population that you're working with, and if there's any kind of, what are your considerations around working with that population? And then how are you going to get consent? Is it going to be in person? Can you do it virtually by Zoom? Are you going to get telephone consent? So if you know what your process is going to be, again, right, it has to go to REB. REB has to look at it and say, yeah, we're good with that, and that's your approach. That's what you can use. And then you're going to use any additional tools. So sometimes videos and pictures are really helpful to people to understand what studies are all about. But again, if you're planning to use those tools, they have to be approved by the Research Ethics Board. It's the informed consent process. You give them the information, you give them the time, answer their questions, make sure they understand, make sure that they're voluntarily agreeing to participate, and then you continue to provide that information to them along the way as it becomes relevant. This is section 4.8.10 in GCP. This is everything that needs to appear in an informed consent document. So, you can see that how it could probably end up being 25, 30 pages long, because all of these things need to be in an informed consent document. And Health Canada, if they look at your informed consent document, which they do, they will look to make sure that every one of these elements are in there. And we have templates on Horizon that we have that can help you with that. So the documentation of informed consent, like I said, it's really important to have a standard operating procedure on how you're going to do it. And then train everybody on your team on your standard operating procedures. We have some YouTube videos available that Stella has done on how to get informed consent that you could have access to. So if you're looking for those things, just let us know and we can point you in the right direction. As you can see on the right, we have multiple standard operating procedures around informed consent that specifically, speak to that. Keep your language simple. We usually say grade 6 to 8. Use lay terms. Only use the Research Ethics Board approved consent with the correct date. And ensure participant signs and dates the consent prior to any study procedure. There's minor exceptions to that Health Canada will allow. For example, if somebody has to fast to come in, but that has to be a well-documented process. And then a copy of the consent goes to the participant or their substitute decision maker, whoever provided the consent. An alteration, I'll talk about a couple of alterations in the informed consent process, and one of them now, because of COVID-19, is getting informed consent via remote mechanisms. And so Health Canada issued a guidance document that said so this was to minimize contact, right? This is still try to get participants on research studies, but so that you didn't have to actually be face-to-face. So that, they put out, you should consider using different methods. You can use email, telephone, text, or old traditional snail mail. If consent is given verbally, read the consent to the participant and provide opportunity for them to ask questions. And they recommended that you consider using an impartial witness, and that really applies to regulated trials. The witness could be a family member, can be on a conference call. A scanned copy of the attestation, which is the signature page of the consent form, could be forwarded to the investigator by mail, or they could take a picture and send it by text. But we need to remind them that if they do this, that this may not be a secure mechanism to transfer information back and forth. And the conversation, if you're having telephone consent, you can record it. But it's not necessary to record it. So telephone consent, we usually do those for survey-based studies, right? So, can I ask you a few questions over the phone? You talk about the study and, do you consent to proceed? Yes or no, and it's documentation. But in that circumstance, it wouldn't be necessary to record it. It just depends on the study. But typically, I would say most of the telephone consent processes that we see are not recorded. And if you're not involving an impartial witness, make sure there's sufficient documentation around the process. And any alteration in the informed consent process needs to be approved in advance by the Research Ethics Board, which includes e-consent. And now a lot of pharma companies are using that. They'll upload an informed consent document on a tablet, and then the patient just kind of walks through and indicates yes, 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 and submit, and off they go. So we're moving more into the virtual world, which is kind of nice, because we don't want to go back to where we were pre-COVID and paper and all that kind of stuff. I think it's really expanded into more rural populations, the more things that we can do remotely. So there's that potential there for more equitable access to research projects. Another alteration of the informed consent process is waiver of consent. So the TCPS2 is a Tri-Council policy statement, and those are the Canadian Ethical Guidelines on Conduct of Human Research that was put out by the tri-agencies, so CIHR, SHRC, and NSERC. And they're pretty consistent with the privacy legislation. So I have bold in red, the default position is always to get express written informed consent. However, if you want to do a research project that's a retrospective chart review, and you want to go back into the clinical files and collect information that was originally collected for the purpose of providing care, you now want to collect that information for the purpose of doing research, then you can submit to the REB. And as long as they meet these qualifications A through F, the REB may grant a waiver of informed consent. So you have to attest that, yes, access to the identifiable information is essential to the research, and that using this information without their consent is unlikely to adversely affect them. Then you'll take appropriate measures to protect their privacy, comply with any known preferences previously expressed, and that is, somebody can, if they're admitted to hospital, they can indicate that they don't want anybody other than their immediate clinical team accessing their information. So they're flagged in the system as and in that way, and then we wouldn't include their information. It's impossible or impracticable to seek consent. This is the one really that's, I wouldn't say it's most important, but it's probably the most important to demonstrate. So yeah, if you're going into a clinical database and there's over 500 charts that you want to look at in a retrospective manner, to go and try to contact 500 people and say, can I now use this information for research? That would be impracticable. And if it's going to jeopardize you doing your study, then the REB is going to look favorably upon that, as long as you have all those safeguards in place. And any other permissions for secondary use of information. So that may mean the department information that you're accessing, or something like that. So so there you can do research, prospective research without consent. Probably not. I think they see that more in the social science and humanities. If or deception and research is more social sciences type research. We're more clinically based, and so the default is if you can get informed consent, you should. And if it's nearly impossible for you to get it for whatever reason, it's a retrospective, then we'll look, we'll try to work with you to make sure that can happen. But retrospective, yes. Prospective, probably not. Just want to leave with some final thoughts. So from the TCPS2, that it's a really important statement that research is a step into the unknown, and because it seeks to understand something not yet revealed, research often entails risks to participants and others. These risks can be trivial, or they can be profound, physical, psychological, individual, or social. So history offers those unfortunate examples, and we talked about that through Nuremberg, through Tuskegee, all really unfortunate historical research events. And those research participants, needlessly, and they were at times profoundly harmed by research, and sometimes even dying as a result. Tuskegee is, a really good example of that. Nuremberg Code came out in 1947. Tuskegee started from 1932 into the 1970s. And even Helsinki was out in 1964. That was a longitudinal research study where, men were subjected to, they were looking at what syphilis did to men, and even after penicillin came on the market to treat syphilis, they never gave it to them because they wanted to see what would happen. And some of these men died, and their wives and children were impacted. So yeah, this is why we try to make sure that we follow these rules and do things the right way. So the ethical principles and guidelines, they really play an important role in advancing the pursuit of knowledge while protecting and respecting research participants in order to try to prevent such occurrences. So I mentioned again, so we remember the 3 core principles: respect for person, get informed consent, let them withdraw if they want to, protect their information, let them know if something new happens that might be relevant to them, then they might say, hey, you know what, I'm out, I don't want to do this anymore, and maintain their welfare. So watch things as they're going along. Concern for their welfare, minimize the risk and maximize the benefit. Make sure the research design is really sound, and make sure there's proportionate benefits and risks to society and individuals. And justice refers to the obligation to treat people fairly and equitably. So equity means that the distribution of burdens of research and participation should be in such a way that no segment of the population is subject, or experiences the harms of research or denied the benefits of the knowledge generated from it. And that's it. That's all I have. And I'll take some questions. If we have any questions, I'll just stop sharing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. Does anybody have any questions? Now, I know we had some submitted questions. If anybody has one, just raise your hand or just feel free to unmute. But before that, Jacquelyn, on behalf of MPART, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude for your engaging and insightful presentation on good clinical practices. And thank you for everyone that attended today and took time out of their evening. I know this topic is extremely beneficial for research professionals, especially those who are pursuing like CCRP certifications from SOCRA. And I thought the presentation was very well. You went over the history of how GCP has become what it is through the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code to the specific day-to-day of coordinator activities or staff duties. I actually will kick off with a question. So in terms of GCP guidelines for monitoring responsibilities, do research groups follow like their institution's monitoring guidelines, or is it within each group to provide like an in-staff internal monitor if it's an investigator-initiated study? And if so, like how do you qualify who can monitor a certain study?
Yeah, so it depends on the study. So if it's investigator initiated, then there is a responsibility to include a monitoring plan, right? So if you have so if it's under a CTA and it's investigator initiated, that's got to be part of your CTA submission is what is your monitoring plan. Risk-based approach, right? So you can say, it's really not a high-risk study, so we intend to do monitoring visits on site every 3 to 6 months or something like that. Just has to be an articulated plan. How you decide who's going to monitor, that's a little tricky. We talked about at one point maybe having some reciprocity with either Vitality or Nova Scotia Health Authority, because they have equivalents especially in Nova Scotia, the Stella's position, for quality assurance. But we don't have a mechanism right now. If you're with a sponsor, with a company, they will provide somebody to come in, but it's part of their responsibility, right, to make sure that there's SDI or SDV, source data verification, and compliance with the protocol. Yeah, and it's all risk-based.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? I might just go with submitted questions if not. I know you answered some of them during your presentation.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I had one that was just submitted, and it was, what are the instances in which verbal consent in some studies is acceptable?
Verbal consent, so like I talked about the emergency department, I mean that, if you've got somebody who needs to go into the cath lab within 3 minutes or something, you can it's more of an attestation because you would also get STM consent. Mm-hmm. That's in a heavy trial. So verbal consent could be, it's almost like, telephone consent. I don't know, like we don't have a whole lot of instances of verbal consent. Sometimes cultural considerations, that's the way that they want to do it, you know.
Okay.
You can do it under those circumstances after engaging with that community and saying what is the best way, right, that we can engage and get informed consent.
If somebody were to do a telephone consent, would they have to record it in that sense? No. Okay.
Nope.
Okay. There was one more. It's if you don't sign a consent form in the same day a patient signs it, what happens?
Well, and that's a note to file, because it really should be documented. It should be contemporaneous, meaning it should be happen at that time. So if that's the person that's conducting the informed consent conversation and they forgot to sign the informed consent form, they should really sign it when they recognize it, make a note to file to say, you know, it was me that did the informed consent. I just forgot to sign the informed consent document on that day. Yeah, so you wouldn't kind of sign it, like go back and backdate it. You would sign it the date that you actually sign it, and then make a note to file to explain the discrepancy.
Okay. There was two more, but I don't know. So one of them was, how do you believe language might impact clinical care? Or I guess maybe research.
Yeah, clinical trial participation language could, if you don't have resources within your team, and I'm thinking mostly of, you know, French language, because we are a bilingual province. So could you potentially unfairly exclude somebody from participation in research if you don't have the capacity to provide translation services? And I guess that could be a problem. And those are things that, you know, you need to plan, I suppose, when you're planning your study. Like I said, the REB doesn't require that documents are translated, but you really, I mean, language shouldn't be something that excludes a research participant from participating in research, I guess. It would be an unfair exclusion. Yeah.
Do you know if any other institutions have the capacity to have a like a French research personnel? Do you know what I mean? Like in some instances that every group can use, or I don't know of any, but.
Well, New Brunswick Heart Center has, but I mean that's for their own sort of internal team. But yeah, I think it's really the capacity is built within the team itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I think those are all the questions.
Anybody go to me if they have questions or if they want more information, or I mentioned YouTube videos, if they want, you know, access to those. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions after the fact as well. And you have my contact information. So yeah, anytime.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. Oh, Erin, go ahead.
Sorry, not a question, just a note, and I don't know if you're involved in it, but if they're expanding who a PI can be, you listed nurse practitioners and pharmacists. They should keep an eye on including physician assistants. We're opening that course at Dalhousie, and they're becoming more common. It'd be a group to include in that expansion.
Yeah, exactly right. No, that's a good point. Thank you, Erin. Yeah, and I do think that was part of a smaller meeting I had a while ago, that those considerations. Yeah, exactly. Thanks
for that, Erin. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. Have a great evening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Bye-bye.